Well, there are plenty of travails, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I'd like to sort of pull back our focus because typically there's some kind of crazy chaos going on in the world. And so we end up talking about one story in particular, whatever the story of the day is. And what I'd like to do is get a little bit of perspective. We're now approaching 6 weeks of Trump 2.0. Um, and whereas, the onset of fascism in the United States is the kind of thing you could talk about every week, and we do on almost all of our podcasts, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the United States is managing its relations with the world at large. And I thought we should do that with Max joining us. And I know you've given all this a lot of thought, Max, but if you could uh, frame what you think, just if somebody says to you, what do you think Trump foreign policy this time around is? Like, what's defining it? How would you characterize it? Where would you start?
It's almost impossible to define because Trump is so erratic. I was just noticing for I was researching something and noticing that in early May, Trump fired Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, and one of the reasons why Waltz was fired, evidently not the only one, but one of the reasons was apparently because Waltz was seen in the White House as somebody who was too eager to cooperate with Israel in attacking the Iranian nuclear program. So, in early May, evidently this was a negative for Trump, and yet less than 2 months later, Trump went and attacked the Iranian nuclear program. So, very hard to characterize beyond saying that the Trump foreign policy is whatever Trump thinks it is that day, and he'll probably think of something different tomorrow. And of course, another example that is, which I'm sure Ed is following more closely than I am, is the ups and downs of Trump's tariffs policy, which almost crashed the markets in early April, then led to a freeze of several months. Now Trump is going back in the direction of tariffs, but he's delayed them from early July to August 1st. And who knows if the August 1st deadline will hold. Um, I just think that U.S. foreign policy right now is very chaotic, very unpredictable. And I think that causes a lot of consternation for our friends and allies around the world. You see it also again in the case of Ukraine, where one week the Trump administration is pausing aid to Ukraine, and the next week restarting it, which they've now done 2 or 3 times. So, what does all of that mean? Damned if I know. I mean, I guess the best you can say for the Trump administration is that some of the worst case scenarios have not yet come to pass. I mean, John Bolton was warning that Trump would withdraw from NATO, and so far that hasn't happened. And Trump seems to be mollified by NATO's pledge to increase defense spending, even though a lot of that is smoke and mirrors. He hasn't entirely abandoned Ukraine, as I feared that he might do at this point. So it's, I guess, the best case is that it's not as bad as it could have been, but it's still pretty bad.
So, so Ed, Max's opinion is chaos, but not as bad as it could have been. What's your take on Trump foreign policy 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, I'd underline the chaos, which I think is pretty bad. But I mean, Max is right; he hasn't pulled out of NATO, etc. But if you are the rest of the world, forget China and forget America. If you want to continue interacting with these two countries, both of which practice different forms of coercive diplomacy. Um, Trump a much, much more random and inconsistent form, but China is definitely a coercive diplomatic power. Let's not, um, underplay that. Then you are, and I used to say, I borrowed a phrase that with Trump you bring fruits to the volcano, but you're really bringing fruits to two volcanoes in the hope neither erupt, and all the while looking for ways to carve out your autonomy. And this, in one form or another, with one or two exceptions, like Russia, which are trying to increase their dependence on China to sustain its ability to fight the war in Ukraine. This is what everybody is trying to do now. They're trying to insure themselves against either superpowers, and both superpowers' coercive diplomacy, and that's that's bringing in a multipolar world in a way that a few years ago I would not have looked forward to multipolarism. But compared to the bipolarity we've got on offer, it's actually starting to look like quite a good deal. Is get autonomy from these bullies, and whatever Trump's ultimate decision is on tariffs. I mean, I don't believe that will come on August the 1st. By the way, he said in early April that he wanted 90 deals within 90 days. Well, 90 days have elapsed, and he's got quotation marks 3 deals, none of which are actual deals. Maybe the Vietnam one is a deal, but the UK one is a framework, sort of agree to agree. We'll fill in the details later. And the China one is a truce between equals. But even if he does get 90 deals by August the 1st, the people on the other side of those deals, presumably South Korea and the EU and Canada and others, will not believe for a second that they have any durability, and will be looking to, and already are, create longer term arrangements with other trading partners that can be upheld, and where there is some sanctity left in the contract bilaterally. Nobody believes there's any sanctity left with contracts, trade or otherwise, with the Trump administration, with the United States. That to me is the sort of real effect. And that's, to use a cliche, tectonic in 6 months. That's a really significant shift in the way the world thinks of itself and thinks of the superpowers.
With the tectonics and the volcanoes, there's a whole sort of theme there working, Ed, which I admire when there's that kind of coherence, at least in our analysis. Rosa, what's your take on Trump foreign policy 2.0?
Well, I'm only 150 miles or so from the famous Yellowstone caldera, which, as we all know, could erupt really at any time and is overdue, destroying most of the Western Hemisphere when it does erupt. So I think the metaphors are totally appropriate. Trump is kind of like the Yellowstone caldera.
Rosa, always looking on the bright side.
Always looking on the bright side. It's. I mean, go back to basics, right? Go back to sort of political theory 101 and international law 101, sort of social contract theory. The one thing that humans as individuals and humans in societies and states want above all is some degree of predictability and stability. And literally on the first day of international law classes, one of the concepts that one tends to teach is the Latin phrase pacta sunt servanda, which essentially means agreements should be kept. Because if you can't count on states to keep their promises at all, then everything falls apart, and you're in the world of Thomas Hobbes rather than the world of John Locke, where states like people are nasty, brutish, and short-lived, maybe short too, who knows? That on the one hand, and I always have this discussion. Of course, every international law student says, well, yeah, but states don't always keep their promises, and more powerful states do stuff to less powerful states. And that, of course, is totally true. But the moments of total breakdown that you get, like the world wars, are the moments when you stop being able to rely on states to really keep agreements at all. And most of the rest of the time, in what we consider normal times in international relations, states, this was a famous phrase by the late Columbia law professor Lou Henkin, said something, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but almost all states abide by almost all their international obligations almost all the time. And this is true, including the powerful states, including when it's inconvenient to them, that by and large, whether it's the US, China, Russia, even the most powerful states, if an international court rules against them, they may sulk a little bit and complain, but they'll comply. If the World Trade Organization, if they get some kind of a negative decision, they'll sulk a little bit, but they'll basically comply. If they enter into a treaty arrangement, they have an alliance, they may sulk a little bit if there's something inconvenient to them, but they will basically do it almost all the time. And there's some degree of unpredictability. They won't do it all the time, but there is enough stability and enough predictability that ordinary states minding their own business can kind of go about their business without having to be terrified all the time that, you know, a superpower is going to do something completely wacky that is totally inconsistent with everything they've ever said they would do in the past. And we've now entered into one of those extremely dangerous eras where the behavior of the United States is utterly unpredictable. And it's not so-called strategic uncertainty, as some have tried to claim, you know, where you sort of say, well, we're gonna mess with our adversaries by kind of pretending to be unpredictable so that they'll kind of be a little bit scared and they'll do what we say because they don't want us to lash out at them. This is, you know, non-strategic uncertainty. This is just uncertainty that is due to having at the head of the most powerful nation on earth a man who, you know, whose foreign policy kind of depends on what he ate for breakfast and who he happened to chat with that day and his mood, which is very, very scary.